4 years ago, I moved the Dan Gable International Wrestling Museum from Newton to Waterloo. I and my wife Bev had started it in Newton. And one hot summer day, I was driving past East Waterloo, my old high school. I graduated from there many years ago. And I stopped in front of the deserted building and looked up, and I was just getting ready to leave, and I saw this little plaque out in front. I got out of the car and I walked up, and the plaque said, "In memory of our classmates who gave their lives for freedom's cause." The first name was Lieutenant Fred H. Becker, and underneath it said, "Killed in the Battle of Chateau Thierry, France, July 18th, 1918. And as I drove away, that name just kept haunting me. And I'd been sports editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and I'd been an Iowa football fan all my life, and I thought to myself, Fred Becker, that's the name of the very first All-American football player at Iowa. Could it possibly be the same Fred Becker? Could he possibly have gone to my high school and I didn't even know it? So I started doing some research. I called up Phil Hattie, the sports information director at the University of Iowa. I said, "Phil, what can you tell me about Fred Becker?" And he said, "Well, he was our first All-American football player. In fact, our first All-American in any sport in 1916. And he was killed in World War I in 1918. And I said, "That is so fascinating. Was he from Waterloo?" And he said, "You know, I think he was." So I went to the Waterloo Public Library and I pulled up the date, July 18th, 1918. And this amazing story unfolded right in front of me. The main headline in the Waterloo Courier, Lieutenant Fred Becker killed in France. And I started reading about Fred Becker on this long, long story, and it told about him growing up on the east side of the tracks in Waterloo. Ironically, he grew up about 3 blocks from where the Sullivan brothers grew up 20, 30 years later and would end up losing their lives in World War II. Fred Becker went to East Waterloo. He was a tall, skinny kid, but they said he had the fighting spirit. And whenever he played football, and he also ran track and played basketball, they said that fighting spirit would always manifest itself. But off the athletic field, it said he was the most popular boy in school. He had a quick smile for everybody. He was vice president of the junior class. He was in all kinds of clubs. He actually was in choir. Said when he went to the University of Iowa, he shocked the Iowa football coach. Back then, freshmen weren't eligible to play, but he was so dominating in scrimmage against the varsity that at times the head football coach would have to hold him out. His sophomore year, 1916, Fred Becker has an extraordinary year. The Hawkeyes are only 4-3, but Fred Becker is voted first team All Big Ten. It was called the Western Conference then. And Walter Eckersall of the Chicago Tribune, the #1 sports writer in America for football, picks him first team All-American. And he said, "The future is bright for the University of Iowa with Fred Becker anchoring the offensive and defensive lines." So the future really looked bright for Fred Becker and the University of Iowa. But over in Europe, World War I was about to break out full bloom. When the United States decided to enter the war, Fred Becker signed up. He took his training at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. He was made an officer in the Marines, and he was sent overseas. Early in the fighting, he was wounded by shrapnel, and he wrote back to his mother in Waterloo, "Don't worry, I'm an Iowan, I'll be fine. I want to get back in the action." One day he's charging up a hill and takes out a German machine gun nest. He's credited with saving the lives of many of his comrades. Shortly after that, he's charging up another hill, way out in the lead of his men, and a single shot to the throat brings him down and kills him. Not quite 22 years of age, Fred Becker, Iowa's first All-American, is buried in France. I thought that was the end of the story, so I went to the American Legion post in Waterloo, which is named the Fred H. Becker Carl Chapman post for another Waterloo soldier who died in World War I. And I was talking to the commandant there, and I said, "You know, it's a shame that Fred Becker is buried in France, because the story said his comrades had buried him right there on the spot where he fell. And he's not here in Waterloo where we could go pay our respects." And the commandant said to me, "Well, no, actually he's buried in Fairview Cemetery right here in Waterloo." And I said, "Golly, I don't think so. No disrespect, but the Waterloo paper said he was buried in France." And so he pulled out this big book and he looked at it and he said, "No, May 14th, 1921, Lieutenant Fred Becker buried in Fairview Cemetery." So I go back to the Waterloo Library and I pull up the newspaper of that date, and sure enough, On May 14th, 1921, Fred Becker was buried in Fairview Cemetery. See, what happened when the war was over, America tried to bring its doughboys home. That's what they called their soldiers. And if they could identify who was ever laying in the grave, they brought him back. So Fred Becker's body was shipped overseas back to New Jersey. It came by train to Waterloo, Iowa. The next day, a huge funeral was held. 2,500 people went to the funeral. The entire church was overflowing into the streets, into the parking lot. And by the time they got to Fairview Cemetery, there were 5,000 people there. It was the largest crowd ever gathered in Waterloo, Iowa, up to that point. And the principal of East High, after Fred's body had been lowered into the grave, said, "We've lost an extraordinary human being." Fred's goal when his football days was over was to get a degree in medicine and become a surgeon and save lives, not take lives. Then I decided I had to write a book about Fred Becker, but there's not enough information to write a whole book. So I came up with the idea of Triumph and Tragedy, a story of 4 extraordinary football players in the state of Iowa, 2 of whom lost their lives while serving their country during armed conflict. The other story is about Jack Trice, who died at age 21 and played in the 1923 season opener for Iowa State. And then in the second game against Minnesota, he suffered such injuries, he died. The other one was Johnny Bright, the great Drake fullback of the 1950s. But of course, the fourth, the one most people know about, is Nile Kinnick. And what an incredible story Nile Kinnick is. You know, everybody knows he won the Heisman Trophy in 1939, and the stadium is named after him. But very few people realize he not only won the Heisman Trophy in 1939, but he won it by the largest margin in the history of the voting. He was Associated Press Male Athlete of the Year. Joe DiMaggio of the Yankees was second, and Joe Louis, the heavyweight boxing champion, was third. He was president of the senior class of the University of Iowa. He was Phi Beta Kappa Scholar. He was the #1 draft choice in the NFL and turned it down to enter law school. And if Nile Kinnick walked into a room today, hardly anybody would notice him because he was 5'8" and weighed 172 pounds. His sophomore year, he led the nation in punting. His senior year, he scored the most important touchdown in Iowa football history when he broke over the left side of the line and scored from 4 yards out with a cracked rib against Notre Dame, ranked #1 in the country, and the Iowa team carried him off the field. Nile Kinnick was an extraordinary human being. He also answered his country's call, and he signed up as a Naval Reserve officer as a pilot. And after Pearl Harbor, he was drafted into action. And on the morning of June 2nd, 1943, off the coast of Venezuela, Nile Kinnick left the deck of the USS Lexington, which would be his final flight. About 2 hours into the flight, he's in a single-seat, small plane. The planes went up by 2s and 3s, and in the plane next to him was a young ensign by the name of Bill Ryder. And Bill Ryder radioed over and said, "Nile, your plane is leaking very badly. You have to take it back. It's not going to stay up much longer." So Nile Kinnick radioed back to the USS Lexington and said, "I have to bring her back. I can't keep it up much longer." And the commander said, "Nile, keep it up as long as you can. We need 20 minutes to clear the deck. Otherwise, we could jeopardize the lives of other people." Nile said, "I will." 20 minutes later, they saw his plane go down way off in the distance. They sent out boats and planes, rescue planes, as fast as they could. It was a calm day, beautiful skies. His plane must have hit at just the angle that they theorize now his head might have struck the dashboard, rendering him unconscious for a short period of time. The plane hit at such an angle, it went down immediately. Nile Kinnick was lost forever, 24 years of age. I toured the USS Lexington 2 years ago. It's now dry docked in Corpus Christi, Texas. It's a museum. It gets 300,000 visitors a year. I called ahead to the public relations director to tell her I was coming, and I told her about Nile Kinnick. She knew he was a good football player, but she didn't know hardly any other details. When I told her about his astounding career at the University of Iowa and what he meant to the state of Iowa, she couldn't wait to meet my wife Bev and I when we got there. She gave us a deluxe tour. I asked her, "Could you tell me which compartment Nile lived in during the 6 months he was on the Lexington?" She said, "No, we don't know specific rooms, but we do know where the pilots would have eaten. the general area they would have slept, and I can take you to the ready room. That's where all the pilots would come in when they were called up. They would sit in these chairs, which are still there today, fastened to the floor, and they would have an hour to an hour and a half to prepare themselves to go on their flight. And she said, since you called, I've done some research on Niall. And the other pilots were always amazed because they'd come in and be a little bit nervous and couldn't concentrate. Niall would come in and sit down and break out either his biography of Winston Churchill or an economics book and sit and read. He was a remarkable human being. I had the great honor of meeting Ronald Reagan in person in 1990, and Ronald Reagan used to announce Iowa football games. I said to President Reagan, there in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois, when I got to meet him, I said, Mr. President, I know you announced Iowa football games for several years. Did you ever meet Niall Kinnick, who came there in 1937? And Ronald Reagan stopped dead in his tracks. He was very interested, and he said, you know, I never did meet Niall Kinnick, but I followed his career very closely. And the fact that the University of Iowa named its stadium after him says it all. It tells you what people thought of Niall Kinnick. And I said to him, Mr. President, isn't it something to think what Niall Kinnick might have been if he hadn't perished in World War II? And Ronald Reagan looked me in the eye and said, I think Niall Kinnick could have been President of the United States. So you think about Fred Becker, what America lost, what the state of Iowa lost. You think about Niall Kinnick, what the state of Iowa lost and what the nation lost. And then you think about the thousands and thousands and thousands of young Iowans who gave their life when their nation called. Men and women, young people, middle-aged people, people who believed in this country, who believed in this state, who believe in freedom, who believe in what the United States stands for. And it's a remarkable testament to Iowa as a state which has always been at the forefront, especially in the Civil War days, all the way up through all the conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, World War I, World War II, Desert Storm, the Iraq battlegrounds, Afghanistan. Iowa should be so proud of its role in the military history of the United States. And let me read to you from my book, Triumph and Tragedy, what the Speaker of the Iowa Legislature had to say about Fred Becker in 1921. Fred Becker was not only a Waterloo boy, he was more. He was a real Iowa boy. He was not only a typical son of our great state in the realm of physical prowess, where he excelled, but he is everything that a young man should be, morally and mentally as well. He stood for everything that was wholesome, square, honorable, manly, and American. So let me conclude by saying Fred H. Becker Elementary School opened in Waterloo, Iowa. The Waterloo School Board voted to name its new school Fred H. Becker because they think his story is so inspirational, so motivational for young Iowans, young Waterloo people, that it needs to be told over and over and over. And I was honored to be the guest speaker at the grand opening. And I concluded by saying to the young people assembled there, over 350 students, I hope that when you walk into the lobby and read about Fred Becker, his story will motivate you and inspire you to be the best you can be, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's on the athletic field, whether it's in any other type of extracurricular activity. And I also pray to God that none of you will have to be called to go 4,000 miles to the other side of the world to give your life for freedom's cause. Let Fred Becker stand alone in that regard.